Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
Karen, reaction continues to pour in from around the world to the death of the architect of the October 7th attacks against Israel. The Israeli military says Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, was killed Wednesday in what appears to be a chance encounter in southern Gaza. Here's Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaking through an interpreter.
I'm standing before you today to inform you that Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar has been eliminated. The person who committed the most terrible massacre in the history of our nation since the Holocaust, the mass murderer who murdered thousands of Israelis and kidnapped hundreds of our citizens, was eliminated today by our heroic soldiers. And today, as we promised to do, we settled the account with him. Today, evil has suffered a heavy blow, but the task before us is not yet complete.
And the news comes as Netanyahu continues to weigh Israel's retaliation against Iran for firing 200 ballistic missiles on October 1st.
Well, Nathan, Sinwar's death leaves Hamas with no clear successor as questions remain about the path forward in the Middle East. And we get more from a Bloomberg Middle East anchor, Jumana Bersetchi.
This is seen as a major victory for the Israeli prime minister and for the Israeli cabinet. It comes on the heels of the killing of the other former political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran a few months ago, and the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, alongside other Hezbollah commanders as well. So very significant moment. But the question from here onwards, and there are many questions, is who will be replacing Yahya Sinwar? Will that person be more open to ceasefire discussions? And indeed, from the Israeli perspective, is there actually a desire to move forward with these ceasefire negotiations? There's a lot of pressure domestically on Netanyahu's government to secure the release of the hostages. It's been over a year now, and it's expected that there are still around 100 hostages. Unclear how many of them are still alive.
Bloomberg's Jumana Bersetchi reporting. President Biden says he's sending Secretary of State Antony Blinken to Israel as part of efforts to end the war with Hamas.
And Karen, Vice President Kamala Harris says Sinwar's death offers a chance at peace.
This moment gives us an opportunity to finally end the war in Gaza. And it must end such that Israel is secure, the hostages are released, the suffering in Gaza ends, and the Palestinian people can realize their right to dignity, security, freedom, and self-determination.
The vice president spoke after a campaign event with college students in Milwaukee. Later, she held a rally in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and talked about her plan to build an opportunity economy.
Which is where every American has an opportunity to own a home, to start a business, to build wealth.
Kamala Harris was joined by billionaire Mark Cuban. He blasted former President Donald Trump's plans for across-the-board tariffs as a tax on everybody. Cuban said, quote, "Donald Trump wants you to have a lousy Christmas."
Well, next week, Nathan, Vice President Harris will be joined on the stump by two of the most popular figures in the Democratic Party, Barack and Michelle Obama. A senior campaign official tells Bloomberg the former president will join Harris in Georgia on Thursday, but the former First Lady will appear with the vice president a week from tomorrow in Michigan. It will be the first time Harris has appeared with either of the Obamas during the campaign.
And former President Trump's getting high-profile support of his own, Karen. The world's richest person, Elon Musk, held an event for the former president yesterday in the Philadelphia area. Musk said the next election will decide the fate of America and the fate of Western civilization.
You know what? I'm being told at times that these are like right-wing values. I'm like, are you insane? There's literally the fundamental values that made America what it is today.
As for Donald Trump, he rubbed shoulders last night with New York City's elites at the Al Smith dinner, and he blasted Kamala Harris for not showing up to the annual Catholic charity event.
My opponent feels like she does not have to be here, which is deeply disrespectful to the event and in particular to our great Catholic community.
Vice President Harris did address the event in a brief video message. Donald Trump also gave an interview to the Catholic news channel EWTN. He said he would consider a religious exemption to covering the costs of in vitro fertilization. Some conservative Christians are opposed to the fertility procedure.
Well, let's turn to the markets now, Nathan. We're watching shares of Netflix. They're up 5.7% this morning. The streaming giant added more than 5 million customers last quarter and eclipsed Wall Street's estimates on every major metric. Netflix CEO Ted Sarandos was glowing about the company's prospects.
Looking into 2025, we're feeling really good about the business. We had a plan to reaccelerate growth, and we delivered on that plan. You can see that in our 2024 financials. We expect to deliver 15% revenue growth and 6 percentage points of operating margin improvement, and engagement, which we view as our best proxy for member happiness, because when people watch more, they stick around longer. So that's retention.
And Netflix's Ted Sarandos says sales in the third quarter grew by 15% to more than $9.8 billion.
Something else we're watching, of course, Karen, is Warren Buffett continuing to unload shares of Bank of America. Let's get the latest on that with Bloomberg's John Tucker. John, this has been going on for a while, and Buffett still isn't saying why he's been selling.
I'm going to guess to make money.
That's one way, yeah.
Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway reaping about $370 million selling stock this week. This according to a filing detailing his 16th round of disposals since mid-July. And this has trimmed Berkshire's stake in the second biggest bank to 9.97%. And that number is important, Nathan. U.S. rules require investors with more than 10% of a stock to disclose trades within a few days. The latest filing may let Buffett provide updates less frequently, potentially leaving fellow shareholders in the dark for months if he sells further. The 94-year-old Buffett hasn't commented exactly why he's pulling back from the investment, though. Thursday's regulatory filing shows Berkshire still remains Bank of America's biggest shareholder, with a stake worth about $32.6 billion. In New York, I'm John Tucker, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, John, thank you. We have some good news for Apple overseas. Sales of the newest iPhones in China are up 20% in their first 3 weeks compared with 2023's model. It's a positive sign for a device that struggled this year to gain traction in the world's largest smartphone market. The iPhone 16 made its debut in September.
And we've got some news on the content front this morning, Karen. Today marks the launch of the Bloomberg Weekend Edition newsletter. Every Friday, we bring you a collection of ideas exploring the fascinating places where finance, life, and culture meet. This week's Weekend Edition features a look at how Starbucks became the Instagrammable hangout for teens and tweens. Also a story about how China's lie flat generation is choosing self-care over luxury goods. Get the Weekend Edition newsletter on Bloomberg.com and on the Bloomberg Business app.
And it is time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. And for that, we're joined by Bloomberg's Michael Barr. Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. A hearing is scheduled for noon on Monday for the man who would have become the first person executed for a murder tied to shaken baby syndrome. The Texas Supreme Court halted last night's lethal injection for Robert Roberson, who was convicted of killing his 2-year-old daughter, Nikki, in 2002. Critics of his conviction say flawed science sent Roberson to death row. Texas Department of Criminal Justice spokesperson Amanda Hernandez.
I had the opportunity to go back there to speak with him, and he was shocked, to say the least. He praised God and he thanked his supporters.
Republican State Representative Lacey Hull is calling for a new trial for Roberson.
There's so much that a jury has never heard, and that what we learned in the committee hearing was that there was so much that was thrown out on hearsay, medical experts, things that were not allowed. So he needs a new trial to have all of this properly heard.
Roberson's lawyers argued new evidence suggests Nikki died of pneumonia made worse by medication. There's a call for a major shakeup at the Secret Service as an independent outlined top-to-bottom failures that allowed a gunman to open fire on former President Donald Trump in July, killing a spectator and injuring Trump and others. The panel wants new leadership from outside the service. In the blistering 52-page report, a new timeline reveals local officers radioed to alert that Thomas Crooks was armed and lying down 30 seconds before shots rang out on the same frequency. But that message never made it to Secret Service. In Argentina, prosecutors in Buenos Aires say that the circumstances surrounding the death of former One Direction singer Liam Payne were suspicious and possibly involved drugs. However, there is no sign of a third party being involved. Payne, 31, died on Wednesday. He shot to fame as a teenager and grappled with the pressures of global stardom. Forensic experts collected evidence a day after Payne was found dead in the hotel courtyard after plunging from his room on the 3rd floor. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with the Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Karen.
All right, Michael Barr, thank you. Time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update with John Stashower. John, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. Thoughts of a Subway Series? Not dead yet, but it took a severe beating last night, especially with the situation the Mets are now in, facing elimination, needing to now beat the Dodgers 3 straight times. They've lost to L.A. 3 times and by a combined score of 27-2. Things started quickly at Citi Field.
There's a shot, right center field, and Ohtani lights the fire. A leadoff home run. Dodgers won, Mets nothing in Game 4.
Fox Sports had, and then Mookie Betts took over. 2-run double in the 4th inning, 2-run homer in the 6th. Dodgers added 3 more in the 9th, won 10-2, lead the series 3-1. Mets stranded 12, went 0 for 10 with runners in scoring position. Earlier, it was ALCS Game 3 and high drama in Cleveland. A routine game for 7 innings. Guardians led 3-1, and then a series of dramatic home runs, 2 for each team. Aaron Judge and Giancarlo Stanton back-to-back in the 8th inning. Judge to tie the game, Stanton to put the Yanks ahead. Yankees were 1 strike from a 3-0 series lead when Jhonkensy Noel belted a pinch hit, game-tying 2-run shot. An inning later, it was David Fry. Guardians won 7-5, trimming the Yankee series lead to 2-1. Here's Aaron Boone.
Amazing game to witness. I mean, that was playoff baseball. Both sides just kept coming with haymakers and big at bats, big moments off of 2 really good bullpens, and they outlasted us tonight.
Another LCS doubleheader today. This time it's the Mets that go first. Game 5 starting at 5 at Citi Field, and then it's Game 4 in Cleveland. NFL, Denver sent New Orleans to a 5th straight loss, 33-10. Sean Payton beats his former team. On the ice, hat trick for Artemi Panarin. Rangers won 5-2 at Detroit. Devils won 3-1 at Ottawa. Islanders lost 1-0 in St. Louis. Longtime Virginia basketball coach Tony Bennett said to be displeased with the changes in college sports, retiring at age 55, won the NCAA tournament in 2019. John Stashower, Bloomberg Sports. Karen and Nathan.
Coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning. I'm Nathan Hager. Both Israel and the United States are celebrating the death of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. Vice President Kamala Harris says the world is better off without him.
Sinwar was responsible for the killing of thousands of innocent people, including the victims of October 7 and hostages killed in Gaza. He had American blood on his hands.
And the vice president says Sinwar's death presents an opportunity to bring the war in Gaza to an end. But Israel is not declaring victory just yet. For more, we are joined by Bloomberg Middle East correspondent Jumana Bersetchi, the anchor of Bloomberg Horizons, with us this morning from Dubai. Jumana, good morning. Now with Hamas leaderless and apparently rudderless, where could this conflict go from here? Good morning.
That is the question that everyone seems to be asking today. And it really boils down to whether these diplomatic efforts are actually going to succeed. And it's pretty apparent that in the last 24 hours, both the President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris have seen this as a window of opportunity to push forward with those ceasefire discussions. The Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, is going to be returning to the region in the next 4 to 5 days. Once more, this would be his 11th trip since October 7 to push forward with those negotiations. But of course, many questions still remain unanswered. The first is who actually will be replacing Yahya Sinwar? Is it going to be an appointee from within Gaza, in which case it complicates those ceasefire discussions, or will it be an appointee like the likes of Khalil Mishal or Khalil Al-Hayya, both of them residing in Doha, which, as we know, Qatar has been a key mediator with those ceasefire discussions. That could help perhaps push them along. On the other side as well, the question is whether there is enough domestic pressure on the Israeli Prime Minister to actually this time around come to a ceasefire agreement in order to secure the release of hostages.
How do you get to a ceasefire agreement, though, Jumana, when Yahya Sinwar was seen as one of the key figures, at least when the discussions were underway, in the ceasefire negotiations, and when Hamas at this point doesn't have clear leadership? Who would they be negotiating with?
Yeah, that is it. So the name that I mentioned earlier, Khalil Al-Hayya, who lives in or has been living in Doha, has actually been involved in those mediation discussions. So if they wanted somebody who is more in the loop of some of the background discussions that have been going on, he could be one name put forward. But at the same time, he lacks the seniority and the leadership and the clouds that Yahya Sinwar had within the party. Don't forget, Yahya Sinwar has been around for decades now. And yes, he was the mastermind of October 7, but for many within Hamas and even for Iran, he was seen as just another figurehead in the so-called axis of resistance. And again, there have been many eliminations of Hamas leaders over the last few years. I'm not specifically talking about Ismail Haniyeh, and they've always managed to keep on. The group hasn't fully been eliminated. So to come back to your question on whether the ceasefire discussions can be successful, the Israeli Prime Minister has clearly articulated that the war in Gaza is not going to stop until Hamas fully lay down their arms. And the question from here onwards is whether Hamas are under so much duress now that they feel that they have no option but to lay down their arms and pave the way for a new type of governance in Gaza.
And in the meantime, there's the effort as well to free the remaining hostages that Hamas is holding in Gaza and the wait for retaliation against Iran over its ballistic missile strike earlier this month. Where do all these multiple fronts stand in terms of that?
Yeah, so multiple fronts being engaged in, and you also didn't mention Lebanon as well. That's the front that has really been heating up over the last couple of weeks. The latest figures pointing to over 2,400 people having been killed since the escalation of that front. A ground incursion still taking place. Airstrikes, we talk about airstrikes not just around the suburbs of Beirut, but there have been some targeted airstrikes in other countries as well, in Damascus and Latakia, one of the coastal cities in Syria. And so it is very clear that the Israeli viewpoint at this point in time is to go after commanders from all over of this axis of resistance, and even sending a drone attacks as far as Yemen to respond to the Houthis. And this, of course, as we all are sitting waiting to see what the likely response is going to be to the Iran ballistic missile attack that happened on October the 1st. We've been talking about the various reports that have come out suggesting that the Israeli response is likely to be centered on hitting military infrastructure and perhaps individual senior commanders as opposed to going after oil infrastructure. But none of us are really privy to the conversations that are going on here. And so it remains to be seen as to whether Israel wants to escalate with the view of this getting expanded, or the conflict getting expanded even further, or, as they have been saying the last couple of months, escalate with the view of de-escalation.
Only about a minute left, Jumana, but prior to Yahya Sinwar's death, there was a lot of pressure being laid on Israel to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza. That letter from Secretary of State Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. Where does that stand now?
Yeah, so there has been efforts on the part of the U.S. not only to push forward on the ceasefire discussions, but also to help from a humanitarian perspective as well. The U.S., that letter that was released a couple of days ago indicated that the U.S. are threatening to withhold military aid if the humanitarian situation doesn't improve, and more trucks and aid trucks are not allowed or have been blocked access from entering into the Gaza Strip. So it is likely that more humanitarian aid will be coming through. But at the end of the day, you're still looking at a situation where 90% of the population is displaced without access to key supplies, medicine, food. A similar situation is playing out in Lebanon with a quarter of the population displaced. And even in Lebanon, where the conflict has only been going on really in this intensity the past month, the first case of cholera has been reported in years, as there, again, rations and medical supplies and access to food is becoming increasingly more difficult.
Thank you, Jumana, for the time this morning. Jumana Bersetchi, anchor of Bloomberg Horizons, with us this morning from Dubai. Now we want to turn to the main market story of the morning. An earnings beat pretty much across the board for Netflix. The streaming giant added even more subscribers than analysts expected, beat every major metric in a quarter that still felt some of the after effects of last year's strikes in Hollywood. Joining us for more on that is Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta. Kriti, good morning. I guess maybe we haven't reached peak Netflix just yet?
Not quite. It's an interesting one this time around because it kind of feels like it's quality of these results, not quantity. And I'll tell you what I mean here in terms of these numbers. When we look at Netflix, we tend to go off subscriber numbers. And I think that might be the wrong approach this time. 5 million subscribers added, 5.07 to be exact. Now, that is higher than the estimates. But if you compare that to a year ago, it was 8.76 million. So year over year, that growth is actually slowing down. That being said, the kind of best part of these numbers is what's happening underneath the hood. And it's all about pricing power, Nathan. This is really interesting. We know the password crackdown has been a very big piece of it. And because there has been that crackdown, it's really spurred this new increase in subscriptions. But then you have to look abroad. So much of Netflix's numbers are also going to be coming from new subscribers, not within the United States, but elsewhere. And as they capture them, charging them a higher rate of that subscription, and especially getting into those kind of different ad tiers. And that's where a lot of that growth is coming from.
Interesting, because there was a lot of thought that the ad tiers were going to lower pricing power. Does that mean that there is still growth potential in the ad side of Netflix's business?
It kind of seems like it. I'll give you a stat here. So when you look at the $699 a month ad-supported tier, it was launched in late 2022, but it looks like that's maybe where most of the growth is happening because half of their new subscribers is where the ad tier is sold. For the membership, it rose 35% within that tier itself. So that's a pretty big deal for the third quarter. And it kind of feels like people are willing at the end of the day to say, all right, we'll watch an ad as long as we don't have to pay those higher prices. But yet again, look at some of the markets that Netflix is adding those higher prices. It's Japan, it's Spain, it's Italy, a lot of the countries in the world where maybe there might be a turn in perception in terms of buying power. It's kind of interesting that Netflix is getting an early indicator of that.
Does that raise the question then about whether growth has peaked in the U.S. and could that be a big deal going down the line for Netflix?
So in the U.S., it's a little bit different because it kind of feels like content is what's driving that story. I mean, Nathan, if you think we could have a whole conversation on what we're watching on Netflix at the moment. But we know that a couple years ago, one of the big criticisms of these studios was simply this idea that the content isn't coming fast enough. We're binging and the studios are taking longer. The Hollywood strike's putting delays in people's favorite shows. But as long as you have that new pipeline, that seems to be where the U.S. audience is more attracted simply because they're getting their hands on it. So in addition to some of these kind of earnings stories as well, the fact that they haven't been impeded as much as expected by those Hollywood strikes, that is a positive for the U.S. audience.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak, your morning podcast on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed by 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 92.9 in Boston, and nationwide on Sirius XM Channel 121.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, now with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto interfaces.
And don't forget to subscribe to Bloomberg News Now. It's the latest news whenever you want it, in 5 minutes or less. Search Bloomberg News Now on your favorite podcast platform to stay informed all day long. I'm Karen Moscow.
And I'm Nathan Hager. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.